Cole's final letter destroys Victoria's world. Claire and Matt's true identities exposed. The air in the Newman mansion felt heavier than usual, almost suffocating, as Victoria sat in her pristine office, the morning sunlight slicing through the blinds and highlighting the tense lines on her face. She had just opened a letter, one that bore Cole's unmistakable handwriting, and from the moment she read the first sentence, it was as though the ground had shifted beneath her, threatening to swallow her whole, because Cole's words weren't just a farewell, they were an unrelenting verdict on everything she had ever believed about her family, about loyalty, about trust, and even about herself. The letter detailed secrets that only someone with intimate knowledge of the Newman inner circle could possibly know, and as Victoria's eyes scanned the page, the room seemed to spin, each line a dagger twisting deeper into her heart, revealing truths she had tried so desperately to ignore. Claire and Matt weren't who they claimed to be, and their carefully constructed personas were a lie from the very beginning. Their smiles, their reassurances, their casual interactions with Victoria and the Newman family now feeling like calculated performances in a long-running deception. She remembered the countless moments she had shared with Claire, late-night strategy talks, whispered confidences, shared laughter over petty corporate frustrations, and every memory now felt tainted, every smile a mask, hiding intentions that were only now, heartbreakingly, becoming clear. Matt, too, the charming, dependable figure who had always seemed so grounded and trustworthy, was suddenly a stranger, his motives inscrutable, his presence a reminder that the foundation Victoria had built her world upon was, in fact, riddled with cracks she had never noticed until now. The letter detailed Cole's suspicions that had long lingered in the shadows, whispers of Claire and Matt's involvement in manipulations designed to destabilize Victoria's control over Newman Enterprises, subtle moves in boardrooms, carefully placed suggestions and misdirections, hints that were easy to dismiss until now. But with Cole gone, the evidence he left behind in painstaking detail painted a portrait that was impossible to ignore, each paragraph a meticulous unraveling of the web of deceit, a precise map of betrayal that left no room for denial. And as she read on, Victoria's fingers shook, dropping the letter onto the mahogany desk with a thud that seemed to echo through the silent office, reverberating like a gavel in a courtroom where she was both judge and accused, because she knew that confronting this truth would change everything. The alliances she had relied upon, the family she had fought to protect, and even her own sense of identity were now uncertain, vulnerable, and exposed. Outside, the city moved on obliviously, unaware of the storm brewing within the walls of the mansion, but Victoria felt it acutely, a tidal wave of emotion, anger, betrayal, fear, disbelief, and grief, colliding all at once as she realized the magnitude of Cole's final act, a letter that was both a goodbye and a reckoning, leaving her with the impossible task of figuring out who to trust, how to respond, and whether the world she had known was ever real. She thought of Nikki, of Jack, of the countless Newmans who had been intertwined in these machinations, and wondered who had known, who had turned a blind eye, and who had truly been innocent. And the more she pondered, the more suffocating the weight of the revelation became, pressing on her chest as if the walls themselves were conspiring to remind her of the fragility of the life she had so carefully curated. And yet, even amidst the panic, a spark of resolve flickered. Victoria was Newman, after all, a woman forged in the crucible of betrayal, accustomed to survival, to navigating treacherous waters where loyalty was scarce and danger lurked behind every smile. So she forced herself to breathe, to think, to strategize, knowing that Claire and Matt's deception could not stand unchallenged, that the truth must be unearthed, even if it meant tearing apart everything she had once held dear, even if it meant facing heartbreak of the most intimate kind. She reached for her phone, her hand still trembling, and dialed Victor, knowing that he alone could provide counsel steeped in the ruthless pragmatism necessary for the coming storm. But as the line connected, another pang of uncertainty struck her. Victor, too, had his own agenda, and while she sought guidance, she knew he might exploit the chaos to his advantage, a fact that only compounded the dizzying complexity of her predicament. Simultaneously, memories of Cole flooded back, his loyalty, his moments of tenderness, the subtle ways he had tried to shield her from harm, and a bitter ache formed in her chest, for Cole's death, whether accidental or orchestrated, now seemed intertwined with the revelation of this deception, and the letter was his final gift and curse, a testament to his insight and a haunting reminder of his absence. As she pieced together the timeline in her mind, the subtle inconsistencies, the small lies, the carefully crafted narratives Claire and Matt had spun, the magnitude of their betrayal crystallized into an icy clarity, and with each passing moment, Victoria's mind raced through possible responses, strategies, confrontations, and exposures, knowing that every move had consequences that could reverberate through the family, the company, and her own life in ways she could barely anticipate. The letter's conclusion offered no comfort, only the blunt reminder that truth, once revealed, was unstoppable, and that she would have to act swiftly, decisively, and with the cunning that had always defined her, because the world she knew, her world, her legacy, was on the verge of collapse, and only her intellect, resilience, and sheer force of will could prevent it from crumbling entirely. Yet, even as a plan began to form in the shadows of her mind, doubts gnawed at her, a relentless undercurrent questioning her judgments, her alliances, and her own perceptions, for if Claire and Matt could deceive her so completely, what else had she missed? What other threats lay hidden beneath the veneer of familiarity and comfort? And what price would she have to pay to reclaim control, restore justice, and secure the Newman name against enemies who were now not just external but insidiously intimate? Time seemed to both stretch and compress around her, the sunlight now harsh, almost accusatory, as if the universe itself demanded she face the chaos unleashed by Cole's final words. And in that crucible of revelation and despair, Victoria understood with stark clarity that life, loyalty, love, and legacy were all precarious, fragile constructs, vulnerable to the subtlest deceit, and that moving forward would require the courage to confront betrayal head-on, the intelligence to navigate a labyrinth of lies, and the heart to endure the profound personal cost of uncovering the ultimate truth about Claire, Matt, and the very foundations of the world she had spent her life building, knowing that once exposed, nothing, and no one, would ever be the same again. Victoria sat frozen at her desk long after the initial shock of Cole's letter had settled into a dull, gnawing ache that radiated through her chest and limbs, as if her body were punishing her for having trusted so completely, and for so long, because trust, she realized now, had been the currency Claire and Matt had exploited to manipulate her, and every instinct she had ever relied upon to read people, to judge character, seemed to have failed her catastrophically, leaving her alone with the raw, unfiltered truth that her life, her family, and even her own sense of self were now riddled with holes that could never fully be repaired. She glanced again at the letter, almost hoping to find a mistake, a misstatement, a shred of misunderstanding that could absolve Claire and Matt from the cold, calculating duplicity Cole had painstakingly outlined, but the handwriting, so familiar and deliberate, offered no comfort, only clarity. Each accusation, each revelation, each confirmation of secret meetings, falsified documents, whispered threats, and hidden alliances was meticulously chronicled, leaving Victoria with no avenue for denial, no room for reinterpretation, only the stark reality that she had been outmaneuvered in ways she had never imagined possible, and yet, despite the overwhelming sense of betrayal, a part of her, the part that had been shaped by the relentless challenges of the Newman legacy, could not let the moment collapse into despair. She forced herself to breathe deeply, counting to 10 as if each number could anchor her in a reality that felt increasingly like a nightmare, because the implications of Cole's final words were staggering, cascading outward like a series of dominoes poised to topple not only her world but the lives of everyone connected to the Newman name. And the complexity of what she now faced was staggering, for Claire and Matt were not merely interlopers in her personal life, they were entwined with the very architecture of her family, influencing business decisions, social alliances, and even the reputations of those she loved most, and each revelation in Cole's letter seemed designed to amplify the tension, to reveal the breadth of their deception and the subtlety of their manipulation, leaving Victoria to wonder how many other actions in her life had been steered, guided, or even sabotaged by hands she had believed were loyal. She thought of her brother Nicholas, of her father Victor, of her mother Nikki, and of Jack, all of whom had relied on her judgment, on her ability to discern motives, to anticipate moves, and now she questioned whether any of them truly understood the depth of the treachery she faced, and whether revealing Claire and Matt's true identities would fracture the family irreparably, because once deception is uncovered, even love cannot fully erase the memory of betrayal, and Victoria felt the crushing weight of responsibility pressing down, demanding not just action but precision. For any misstep could escalate the chaos, exposing her to attacks on her reputation, her authority, and even her emotional stability. She rose from her chair, pacing the office, the soft click of her heels on the marble floor echoing through the mansion as she replayed the letter in her mind, examining each line, parsing each implication, imagining every possible response, and yet, despite her growing anxiety, a spark of resolve ignited, a flicker of the fierce, unyielding Newman spirit that had seen her through boardroom battles, personal heartbreaks, and corporate sabotage, because if Cole's death had left a void, it had also left a roadmap, a guide through the labyrinth of lies that had ensnared her, and she knew instinctively that she could not, would not, allow Claire and Matt to succeed in undermining her life or her family's legacy. She thought of confrontations, private and public, of calculated reveals and controlled disclosures, of strategies that would expose the truth, while protecting those she loved, and of the delicate balance she would need to maintain to prevent the fallout from spiraling into irreparable destruction. Because in the world of the Newmans, power was never just about money or influence, it was about perception, about controlling the narrative, and about ensuring that the truth, when revealed, served justice rather than merely satisfying vengeance. And Victoria realized that her next steps would define not just her immediate future but the very shape of the Newman empire for years to come. She considered the possible reactions of Claire and Matt, their potential denials, their manipulations, the alliances they might try to form to counteract her moves, and the lengths they could go to protect themselves, and the awareness of their cunning only strengthened her determination to act strategically, to anticipate every contingency, and to leverage every piece of information Cole had left behind, because the letter, though a posthumous blow, was also a weapon, a tool that, if wielded correctly, could turn betrayal into justice, and deception into exposure. As she thought, Victoria also felt the personal sting of the betrayal, a mixture of sadness and anger that settled deep in her bones, because trust, once broken, is not easily rebuilt, and the intimacy she had shared with Claire and Matt, the moments of laughter, the confessions, the apparent solidarity, were now tainted, colored by the shadow of manipulation, and she found herself questioning not just them but herself, her judgment, and the very mechanisms by which she had navigated the complexities of her family and business for so many years, realizing that even the strongest instincts are vulnerable to clever subterfuge, and that experience, while valuable, could not always protect against deceit so carefully orchestrated. Yet, amid the turmoil, Victoria began to formulate a plan, mentally outlining the steps she would need to take to confront Claire and Matt, to gather allies, to secure evidence, and to control the narrative, knowing that timing, subtlety, and precision would be crucial, because in the Newman's world, a miscalculated move could cost not just credibility but freedom, safety, and legacy. And as she walked to the window, looking down at the city below, she felt a mixture of fear and empowerment, a duality that came with understanding the stakes so clearly, because while the path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, it was also illuminated by the clarity of truth, and Victoria knew that embracing that clarity, harnessing it, and acting decisively would be the only way to reclaim control, to honor Cole's memory, and to ensure that the secrets, lies, and manipulations of Claire and Matt would not destroy everything she had worked for, everything she had loved, and everything she had fought to protect. And so she took a deep breath, steeling herself for the battles to come, for the conversations, confrontations, and revelations that would define the coming days, the coming weeks, and perhaps even the future of the Newman Empire, because in the aftermath of betrayal, in the wake of death, and in the midst of unimaginable deception, Victoria Newman, with her indomitable will, razor-sharp mind, and unshakable courage, would not only survive, she would reclaim her world, piece by piece, strategy by strategy, truth by truth, exposing the lies of Claire and Matt in a reckoning that would be as dramatic, as devastating, and as unforgettable as the letter that had started it all. Victoria's mind contended as she considered every angle, every possible influence of exposing Claire and Matt, knowing that the ramifications would ripple far beyond the walls of the Newman manse and into every corner of Genoa City, because in a world where power, perception, and fidelity were constantly shifting, indeed a single disclosure could enkindle fires that couldn't be controlled. And as she replayed the details Cole had painstakingly outlined, she realized that timing would be everything, that each word she spoke, each move she made, would need to be measured with perfection to maximize impact while minimizing contributory damage, because exposing deception too hastily could boomerang, allowing Claire and Matt to manipulate sympathy, draft new narratives, and turn the tables on her in a way that would be both particular and professional, and she would not, allow that to be, she allowed. Of the people who might stand with her, those she could trust, and those who might waver under pressure, knowing that alliances in her world were no way endless, and that indeed those who claimed fidelity could be swayed by ambition, fear, or the appeal of being on the side that eventually appeared victorious, and the complexity of the chessboard she now faced was stunning, each piece representing not just a person, but influence, character, and power, and the stakes were nothing lower than the survival of her family, her company, and her own sense of identity, because Cole's letter hadn't simply exposed a treason, it had reared the veritably foundations of her life, shaking her confidence, her trust, and her hypotheticals to their core, and as Victoria paced the office, her heels clicking against the polished bottom, she began mentally rehearsing competitions, imagining the shock in Claire and Matt's eyes, the protective pushes they would essay, and the subtle facades they would try to weave to maintain control, and each possibility strengthened her resoluteness, because to vacillate, to alternate conjecture, to allow query to paralyze her, would be to surrender, and rendition was a word Victoria Newman didn't entertain. Contemporaneously, swells of grief and fury washed over her as she allowed. Of Cole, of his early death, of the circumstances that had forced him into secretiveness, and of the courage it must have taken to write the letter that now mandated her coming moves, and she realized that his final act was both a blessing and a burden, a roadmap to verity that demanded action, and yet reminded her of the fragility of life and the unpredictability of those around her, because if Cole could be silenced, if trust could be betrayed so fully, also the trouble of father. Deception was constant, brewing, and necessary, and Victoria couldn't go to ignore it for a single moment. She reached for her phone. Thinking of Victor, whose mind was as sharp and calculating as her own, but whose styles were frequently ruthless and changeable, knowing that he could give the strategic sapience necessary to strike Claire and Matt's schemes, and yet also apprehensive that involving him might unleash forces beyond her control, because Victor's description of justice was no way purely moral, but always calculated to maintain power and dominance, and navigating that dynamic needed both finesse and advice, and the mindfulness of this duality only stoned her internal perceptivity, forcing her to consider not just what she'd do, but how, when, and why each step would be perceived by others, she allowed. Of her father, who had always emphasized the significance of heritage, of icing that the Newman name remained untouchable, and the knowledge that Claire and Matt's dishonesty hovered not just her own character but the family's literal dominance added a subcast of urgency to her planning, because in the ruthless world of commercial conglomerates and social influence, exposure without control was tantamount to tone destruction, and Victoria understood with nipping clarity that her every decision from this point forward would need to be strategic, surgical, and implacable, and that any emotional impulse, any transitory wrathfulness, any particular vendetta could be exploited against her by those who thrived on chaos and manipulation, and this mindfulness fueled both her caution and her determination, for she'd not allow herself to be overreached, outsmarted, or emotionally compromised in a battle that demanded the full measure of her intellect, countenance, and strength. As she counterplotted out implicit competitions, Victoria imagined how she'd orchestrate the disclosure of Claire and Matt's true individualities, considering private meetings where trueness could be still vindicated, public exposures where deception could be easily demonstrated, and subtle manipulations that would ensure the outside exposure of facades while minimizing gratuitous fallout, and in her mind's eye, she played through the sequence constantly, conforming variables, anticipating responses, prognosticating counter-moves, and enriching her strategy with the scrupulous perfection of a general preparing for battle, because in the realm of the Newmans, emotion could no way be allowed to stamp computation, and Palm was always a product of planning, tolerance, and the amenability to apply power without vacillation. She reflected on the particular risk of what she was about to do, the ineluctable heartache, the treason of trust, the battle of Gemütlichkeit that had sounded genuine, and yet she honored that inactivity was no longer an option, that the longer the deception remained unchallenged, the lesser the threat to her family, her conglomerate, and herself, and that the only path forward was a combination of ruthless strategy and unwavering courage, because verity, formally weaponized, could be both ruinous and liberating, and Victoria resolved to apply it with perfection and intent, to expose Claire and Matt in a way that left no room for denial, no avenue for manipulation, and no possibility of escape.